Michelle. So I'll be hanging out here, and then I think Bruce is going to be in 200, or he'll be going back and forth.
Oh,
I don't
he's
know.
going to stay for it?
Yeah.
Oh,
he said he
God.
wanted to hang out, so he was like, I'll just be here.
Cool.
Yeah, he's super interested. But we already tested the mics. Everything should be working all good. I don't think he does, but I still do. Because I was here. I called it first, and he said I'm also staying. Oh my God. That's the best. It's the best. It's the best surprise. Yeah. And I'm not really a bag person, so I have to become a bag person. And I hate that. We just changed the monitor actually, and I think that's because it's the one that's broken, so it doesn't stay up. Yeah, so. Yeah, right.
Hi, everybody. If everyone would make room for the people that are coming in, that would be really helpful. As you can see, these are not the easiest chairs to move out of the way for someone to come in and sit. So if you move to your right or left to accommodate people who still have not been seated, we'd really appreciate that. Thank you.
Good evening. Excuse me, everybody. We're going to get started in just a minute. Good. Okay, we can wait until the end for that. Good evening. Welcome to Community Medical School at the UVM Larner College of Medicine and the UVM Medical Center. In just a moment, I'll introduce Dr. Ratu, who will be introducing our speakers for the presentation tonight. Before I introduce him, I'd like to remind you to save your questions until the end of the presentation. At the end of the presentation, we'll have 30 minutes for Q&A. Please do not ask your questions until you have a microphone in your hand. We will be handing out microphones. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Ratu.
All right, good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out despite the not so great weather. As mentioned, my name is David Ritu. I'm a child psychiatrist here at the UVM Larner School of Medicine, and I'm the director of the Pediatric Psychiatry Clinic here at the hospital. I'm guessing that one reason why many people are here is that they're trying to get some reliable information about a very confusing topic. When it comes to cannabis and marijuana, there's certainly a lot of information out there, but it's all over the place. You hear that marijuana will end the world as we know it. You hear that it will cure cancer and chronic pain and solve the opiate problem. You hear that it can cause schizophrenia. You hear that you actually drive better when you're high. There's probably two reasons that there's so much confusion. One of them has to do with the messenger. Some are people who don't use cannabis and are afraid of it. Some are people who do use cannabis and want to justify it. And some are people connected to a new multi-billion-dollar industry that depends on users to keep it profitable. All of these things can influence how people consume and process information. But there is also real complexity with the topic itself. Personally, I believe that some cannabis-based compounds will show real therapeutic value for certain conditions, while at the same time, I also believe that cannabis use will reveal itself as one of the major public health problems of the next decade. Furthermore, I believe that many of these problems are due to our own gullibility, is that a word, gullibility? To fall for the exact same tricks that the tobacco industry played 50 years ago. I think the saying goes, fool me once, right? You've heard it. So these are some tricky waters to navigate. But fortunately tonight, we have two very capable guides. One of them is Peter Jackson. He's an assistant professor of psychiatry here at the Larner College of Medicine, who's been trained both in child psychiatry and addiction psychiatry, which is a very rare combination. He received his medical degree from the University of Utah and completed his residency in psychiatry at the University of Michigan before doing his child and addiction training, right, both at Mass General, is that right? But at Harvard Medical School at Mass General Hospital. He currently serves on the Youth and Adolescence Committee for the American Academy of Addiction Psychiatry, and I would just have to say that the state is very fortunate to have him here as part of the team. Karen Lansbury is a professor of pharmacology and the director of the foundations level of the Vermont Integrated Curriculum here at the Larner College of Medicine. She received her doctorate degree in pharmacology from the University of Pennsylvania and is currently the course director for a number of courses here, including the University of Vermont's medical cannabis course. Additionally, she runs a pharmacology research lab and teaches lectures on drugs of abuse, focused on both the biology underlying the development of addiction, as well as specific receptor-based therapies to reduce cravings. So please join me in welcoming both of these great experts to talk about this important topic. And I think we're going to start with Dr. Lansbury, and I think I'm supposed to turn this off, so you can use that mic.
Good evening, everybody. And I'm really glad to see a lot of you came out to listen to what we have to say tonight about this topic, as was told, is a very confusing topic. And having taught the medical cannabis course, doing a lot of research for that course, I can tell you that I keep hearing really interesting cases, really unusual stories. And what I'm going to try and do tonight is a very diverse audience with many different types of backgrounds. And so I'm going to try and make sure that everybody can understand what I'm talking about. And I'm going to basically go into how cannabis affects primarily the brain, but I'll talk a little bit about its effects in pain so that we can kind of understand why it has medical benefits. And then we'll also shift on to talking about effects on the brain related to its psychoactive effects. Why can something that has psychoactive effects also treat pain? So that's going to be my section, and then the next section is going to be by Dr. Jackson, and he's going to talk more about child pediatric specific development of the brain and how cannabis has its effects on the developing brain. So before I get started, I do want to make a disclaimer that we are both members of the University of Vermont faculty, and that the materials we present really represent our own research and views and not necessarily the views of the University of Vermont. And I will talk about a few pharmaceutical agents, and I'll present them according to their FDA approvals, and I have no financial interest to disclose related to that. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about the effects of cannabis on pain and pleasure pathways. And I title it Cannabis, but I'm really going to talk about cannabinoids, because there are different chemicals within cannabis that have different effects on pain and pleasure pathways. So the big question is cannabis a medicine or is it a drug of abuse? And it really can end up being both. There are proven medical values and also proven abuse issues related to cannabis. So first I'll talk a little bit about the plant itself. So cannabis sativa produces many compounds that they're secreted by these little trichomes in the flowers and the leaves, primarily in the flowers. And what they've found through culturing and doing different breeding is that the most amount of cannabinoids are produced in frustrated flowers, meaning flowers that aren't able to get pollinated. And so the plant will make more flowers of the female plants, and they produce more and more cannabinoids. So that suggests that the reason why the plant is making these cannabinoid chemicals in the first place is to try and get sticky so that the pollen will stick better to the flowers. That's the best piece of evidence we have from the botany side of it. There's a lot of different strains of cannabis, and we know that they have different levels of the biologically active components. Hemp, as well as sativa and indica strains of cannabis, are really the same species of plant, but they produce different types of chemicals. That's why they look somewhat similar, and they can interbreed with each other to form different types of strains. So talk a little bit about the biologically active cannabinoids that are found within cannabis. Cannabis produces over 100 cannabinoids, and this is really a treasure trove of potential chemicals that could have some medicinal value. There's not very much known about them, except for two compounds, the delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which is THC. This is it activates CB1 and CB2 receptors, which I'll talk about in a little while. It is the component that is psychoactive, meaning it's the component that gets you high, and it also is the component that promotes anti-pain and anti-nausea activities. It also has anti-spasm and anti-inflammatory activities. The other compound that's had a lot of interest lately, and you can find it in your local grocery store basically, is cannabidiol, or CBD. This compound doesn't have the same activity as THC. In fact, it seems to negate a bit the effects of THC. And it's thought that its effectiveness as a pain reducer and an anti-seizure activity is either through this activity of blocking certain types of channels that are found in the brain, and also affecting serotonin receptors, which are called 5-HT receptors, and having effects on anxiety. So it may have possible activities that are outside of what we know right now, but it does have anti-seizure activity and anti-pain activity. So one thing that's interesting is that the plant itself has this combination of these chemicals, and we know that if you take simply THC, the drug Marinol, which is a prescription drug, which is synthetic THC, it has anti-pain activity, but it also causes anxiety. Whereas cannabidiol doesn't cause any psychoactive effects and actually is thought to maybe moderate the effects of THC. Both of these compounds are activated by heating. When the plant has them on their surface, they aren't terribly active in the body. But once they're heated by smoking or vaping, baking, or heat extracting them, then they become active. So what do we know about cannabis as a medicine? Now, the compounds within cannabis, the THC, and now more studies have looked at cannabidiol as well. There's a lot of studies with those individual compounds, especially since THC, we have the synthetic form, which is already a pharmaceutical FDA-approved molecule. So THC itself has proven effectiveness for chronic pain, chemotherapy-induced nausea, seizures, spasticity for MS and cerebral palsy, and cachexia, which is a disorder where somebody is unable to eat and they have wasting disorder. It's usually related to some other disorder as well. Some that are likely effective, again, this is for THC, are the potential in eating disorders, for glaucoma, and for anxiety disorders. There are a lot of studies undergoing right now for post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, because it has some, there are a lot of case studies that report that it does have some activity. As of right now, we don't have any proven clinical trials that have really been harsh enough in their, in able to tell whether it's really active at PTSD. There are some proposed effects from individual case studies for use in addiction to prevent opioid addiction or to treat opioid addiction, in Parkinson's and Alzheimer's because it has neuroprotective effects, in inflammatory diseases because it affects the immune system, and in cancer. It's already been approved for, the THC has been approved for use in cancer for anti-nausea and anti-pain. However, there have been some studies that show that it may have effects on the cancer cells themselves. But I will point out that these studies are very early. They're done on individual culture cells of cancer. We don't have any studies that have proven any effectiveness in humans for the treatment of cancer. So please, I urge you not to give up treatments to use cannabis at this point for treating cancer. CBD is very interesting because it has been shown to be effective against seizures, especially childhood seizures. It was accidentally found to be effective in a few patients, and now we've had large clinical trials that have shown its proven effectiveness. And we have a recent medication, Epidiolex, which is cannabidiol that's extracted from cannabis, that is now FDA approved for some childhood seizures. But what I will say is that what we have for whole plant cannabis is very small. We don't have very many studies. There are some that show effectiveness in pain and some that show effectiveness in nausea, but because of all the restrictions in doing clinical trials with whole plant cannabis, we don't have much information about its medical use. We have a lot of information about cannabis and its effects on addiction, however. So what I want to shift to now is how your body uses these cannabinoids. So we're talking about THC binding to these receptors and getting you high and also blocking pain. How does that work? So what I have over here is this is the structure, the chemical structure of THC. And it doesn't really mean all that much as far as, I'm not going to try and say, oh, well, this hydroxyl group does something. It's more to show you that its shape. This is what your body makes. It's called anandamide, and there's another chemical called 2-AG. Your body makes these endogenous cannabinoids. Endogenous means that you produce them yourself. So when you have a strong signal by your nerve cells, you release compounds that activate the pain signal. And one of these receptors, it's a glutamate receptor, will bind and it produces a signal that leads to the production of these endogenous cannabinoids, such as anandamide. So really, they get released by your own nerve cells to shut off the pain signal. So it's as if this signal is too strong, they get produced and it turns off the signal. Does anybody know of another endogenous compound that has a similar type of effect that gets released when there's overactivity of pain signals? Endorphin, exactly. So endorphins are your endogenous opioids. So when your brain, when your nerve cells get hyperstimulated, you have a release of your endogenous opioids like endorphin, another one's called enkephalin, and they shut down the pain pathway. So these actually act in somewhat of a similar fashion, but the receptor is very different. So opioids cannot activate cannabinoid receptors, and cannabinoids cannot activate opioid receptors. So they are separate, but they have some similarities. If you look at how cannabinoid receptors act in pain and nausea, when you have your pain signal, if this signal is really strong, it can cause that production and release of your endogenous cannabinoids. So those receptors that are responding to the endogenous signal are what bind to the plant cannabinoids like THC. So instead of you releasing it yourself, if you smoke or eat or take a cannabinoid, it will bind to those same receptors and shut down the pathway regardless of whether your endogenous signal is activated. So that's how it can reduce pain signals, and it also can, and your nausea signals are also nerve generated, so it can reduce nausea. And so the endocannabinoids and cannabis reduce the pain signal and the interpretation of pain. And it's similar to the action of opioids, but first off, they're not as effective as opioids. Opioids are much superior as far as their ability to stop pain. However, they do have some effect, and because it's a different receptor mechanism, you could potentially combine the two together with a lower dose of opioid so that you're not taking as many opioids. They do produce less tolerance, so unlike opioids where somebody will need to use more and more, there's less tolerance. There is some, though. Less risk of addiction, although as we'll talk, certainly not a zero risk of addiction. One important one, though, is there's a very low risk of overdose with THC and cannabidiol. There's almost no risk. THC, the overdose, is mostly a high anxiety response, which is still an awful response, but it's not like opioids where you stop breathing. So there is some potential for looking at the possibility of using cannabinoids as either an adjunct, so in addition to opioids, or as a replacement. But I will say there are a lot of studies ongoing right now, but we don't have really a lot of evidence to support it, and almost no evidence to support whole plant cannabis as a replacement. So next I'll move on to intoxication. So I talked about the pain signal being reduced, and the same thing happens to your nerves in your brain that have these cannabinoid receptors. So where are the cannabinoid receptors? They're in the cerebral cortex, so that's your thinking part of the brain. They're in the prefrontal cortex, which I'll spend a lot of time talking about, because this is the area that most of the psychoactive effects reduce signaling to the prefrontal cortex. They affect an area of the brain that's important not just for learning, but also for being able to keep track of time. They have an area of the brain, the hippocampus, which is important for memory, gets turned down, and the cerebellum. So those are the major areas that you have receptors. And this intoxication is attributed to THC component within cannabis. So the head rush and euphoria associated with it is related to an area of the brain we call the reward pathway. It's an area in the middle of your brain that stimulates the prefrontal cortex and the cortex and makes you feel that high sensation. Appetite increase is because of effects in the hypothalamus, and decreased attention and sedation effects are because of the hippocampus and signaling reduction to the prefrontal cortex. The altered perceptions and hallucinogenic effects of THC are because of that reduction of the prefrontal cortex. So the way the prefrontal cortex works is it's really how you take in information and process it based on how much you've learned. It gives you the awareness of the senses in a different way, distorted sense of time, a preoccupation with distractions, and it's also the source of where the giggles come from. So the prefrontal cortex is really active to new experiences. So when you get a new learning activity, and you process it and you think it through, especially if it's something that really affects you. Like, you know, if an event has happened, like a really influential event in your life, you will remember things better about what had happened at that time. And that's partly because your prefrontal cortex gets hyperactive and it helps you to engage in long-term memory. So you have your planning and organization, or your working memory, and also your ability to take in the environment. Selective attention. So the very first time you ever drove a car, you were probably looking all around. I don't know if you remember, I remember just teaching my son not that long ago, and he was just so distracted by everything around him. But then as he got more experience, you learn that what you should pay attention to. So that selective attention and noticing a change in your environment is really part of the executive function of the prefrontal cortex. And creative problem solving as well. So I'm focusing on the prefrontal cortex because it's that signal that really gets primarily affected by THC in the brain. And so just to give you an example, your perception of what you see in this photograph, you know, it looks fairly normal. Your perception's a combination, your sensory input, your prefrontal executive function. And if all of a sudden you see that, it's like, wait, something's not right there all of a sudden. There's something that doesn't fit with what I have learned so far. So that's where your prefrontal cortex comes into. And you can distinguish when something's wrong in the environment. So there are other activities besides getting high that reduce the activity of the frontal cortex. That would include meditation, intense exercise, or the runner's high. It's thought to reduce activity in the frontal cortex primarily because you're shunting activity from your higher cognitive centers, and it affects the prefrontal cortex. Daydreaming, and you're just off, which is very similar to meditation as far as what happens in your brain. You're disengaging the frontal cortex, and you can still perform very complex activities when you aren't even thinking about it. Have any of you ever driven somewhere that you drive all the time and you have no idea how you got there? It's because the other areas of your brain, your basal ganglia, can autopilot you without really engaging your prefrontal cortex. And then if you have, like if a car all of a sudden pulls out in front of you, you can snap back into having activation of the frontal cortex. So these are all important functions that your brain has that when under the influence of THC, you're removing, it's almost as if you're in a daydream when you're under the influence. So drugs of abuse that reduce cannabis and opioids are both drugs that can affect the prefrontal cortex. So what does cannabis do to attention? You know, there are some controversies over what effects cannabis has on driving ability. And what I'll point out is that your peripheral attention is definitely reduced when your frontal cortex is reduced by THC. So you can become absorbed in an object. Say a butterfly is floating by and you're driving. You might get too absorbed in that object to notice that a little kid has run out in front of your car. And so it can be an exclusion to everything else. Both short and long-term memory impairment occurs, which can affect your ability to drive. And your image perception, because of the hallucinogenic effects, can also be changed by THC. Now, motor coordination is the primary reason why there is that conception that it doesn't impair your driving, because THC and cannabis effects in general don't cause a lot of change in motor coordination. So somebody might be able to pass a field test for sobriety, for example, but they could still be impaired with respect to being able to drive. So one fact down here based on statistics is that states that have legalized recreational use do have an increase in car accidents. And especially if there's a combination of alcohol and cannabis, which is much higher rate in states that have recreational cannabis. Because in states that don't, it's generally either patients are under the influence of cannabis or alcohol, not combining it as much as in states that have recreational. there is no significant difference in the fatal car accidents with legalized cannabis. But obviously, it is having some effect on ability to drive. So when we talk about this frontal cortex impairment, I want to give you a little test to see how your frontal cortex function is working. So to demonstrate how you might be affected under the influence, I want you to identify the color of these words in your mind. And if you're colorblind, I apologize, but you'll just have to. So that's pretty easy, right? Now, what I meant by distractors and not being able to defocus on a distractor is to now try to identify the color of the words. It takes a lot longer because now you have a distractor. You have a word and you have a color. And so when you read the word red, it keeps you from wanting to say blue. So this type of a task, if somebody's under the influence of THC, it will be really difficult for them to do this because of that distractor effect. So one possibility of a field test, for example, for intoxication would not necessarily be just, you might do a motor coordination test, but to also do something like this. Unfortunately, different people will have different abilities, so I guess you'd have to take a base test when you get your driver's license and then take it again or something. But that's to give you the example of how you have a delay in completing a test like this. So how do we put cannabis addiction in perspective with respect to, I talked about the possible, the medical effects, proven medical effects. How does that come into play with addiction? And what I want to do is, because there is such a strong belief one way or the other for people with respect to addiction to cannabis, I want to put it in perspective with the other drugs that are addicting. So we have approximately 30 million drugs that we know already, and I'm sure we will have many more, and only about 100 of them are addicting. And a lot of the drugs that are addicting are natural products that have been brought from plants or ethanol. And so I want to talk a little bit about what properties make drugs addicting. So the compound dopamine is made by a lot of your nerve cells and stimulates receptors. And receptors for this dopamine in that area of the brain, the reward pathway, that's affected by all drugs that have been found that are addicting. So we know that this pathway is really important. The faster acting, the faster it can get into the brain, and the more possibility it will be addicting. Now, we know from opioids that that's not necessarily the case, and that it was thought that if you take an oral opioid, you're not going to get addicted. It's only when you inject it because it's really fast. But we now know that you can become addicted to ones that you take by mouth. But it's a little less risk, but still definitely a problem. If you take away the drug, you get an inhibition of this pathway, and the patients feel a withdrawal effect. So that's another property. And when you use animal models, so say you use a rat model, the animal will voluntarily give themselves that medication. And there's drug-seeking behavior associated with it. So you can be off of the addicting drug, and then something will trigger it, and it will go back to drug-seeking behavior. So this reward pathway I'm talking about, it's deep in the brain, and DA is the symbol for dopamine. And these signals head up to the prefrontal cortex that I was talking about, with lowering prefrontal cortex activity as part of the high for THC. And it's thought that your endogenous system, as somebody pointed out, endorphins, which are the opioids your brain makes, and cannabinoids, your endogenous man-made cannabinoids, affect receptors that feed into this reward pathway. So even though these are both inhibiting nerve signals, they're inhibiting an inhibitor. So they actually stimulate the reward pathway by blocking the inhibition of the reward pathway. And both cannabis and opioids act in that way. So these are the parts of the brain, I'm sure, but the main one is I keep coming back to that prefrontal cortex. The dopamine that's the important neurotransmitter, and the overactivity of this area is linked to psychological addiction. So it's really kind of hijacking your reward pathway. You normally stimulate this reward pathway when something good happens. You know, you get an A on a test. You're doing something athletic that's really fun. You know, you're normally getting that activity. And so when you hyper-stimulate it by inhibiting this inhibition of the pathway, you end up hijacking your normal reward, and so you will only feel the reward if you have these addicting drugs. And I have on here the other drugs of addiction that affect this pathway, like cocaine and amphetamines, nicotine, and they all have effects by increasing the dopamine signaling. So the addiction potential for cannabis is about 9%, which sounds pretty low. It is a lot lower than, here's tobacco at 32%, and heroin and cocaine, alcohol at 15%. And we know alcohol is the 4th leading cause of death in men in the United States, alcohol-related hepatic cirrhosis. So we know that even though it's 15%, 92% of the general population uses alcohol, and a smaller but significant percentage of that population becomes addicted to alcohol. So even though it's 15%, it's still a very significant portion of the population that suffers from alcohol addiction and its negative effects. So the issue with marijuana is that at 9%, if we have 46% of the population using it, what's going to happen if it's 80% of the population using it? You know, even though it's still only 9%, you still have a significant number of people who are having this addiction potential. The big difference is that the physical harm itself from marijuana is much lower than many other drugs of abuse. This is circling the 3 most common social drugs: marijuana, alcohol, and tobacco. You can see tobacco has very high on the dependence scale, so dependence is going up in this direction. Physical harm, meaning potential for overdose or potential for future disease. Marijuana is relatively low with respect to physical harm, but it does have dependence. And then you have heroin way up here, which has a high risk of dependence and a high risk of physical harm because of the overdose potential. So I'm going to sort of segue over to Dr. Jackson by just talking about how young people are particularly vulnerable to the addiction. There's a substantially higher risk for substance use disorder when an addicting drug is started before the age of 18. And that's really where the public health issue comes with cannabis. If everybody waited until they were 25 when their prefrontal cortex is well developed, but that's a rarity when you have a recreationally legal drug. The chronic adverse effects of cannabis are more likely to develop in younger patients. Any of those rare types of things that happen, it's more likely to develop. And so I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Jackson, and he's going to talk more about the psychiatry and the actual risks to public health in the pediatric population. Thank you.
All right. Does the volume seem okay on the microphone? Okay. Do we have any teenagers here tonight? High school, any high school students? Okay. So sometimes I feel like as a child and adolescent psychiatrist, I'm sort of like the equivalent of the Lorax. Like I speak for the kids. So that's a lot of the perspective that I'm going to give tonight. I'm really happy to be here, grateful to be presenting with Dr. Lansbury, just interacting with her as we got ready for this. I have learned so much, and I hope it'll be a useful discussion for us tonight. I'm grateful to be in Vermont. I've only been here a little over a year. Really excited to join the faculty here, and I love the child psychiatry folks that I work with. I spend just so you know, clinically, I spend about half my week working in inpatient and outpatient child and adolescent psychiatry, and about half my week working in our addiction treatment program at UVM. So, which direction does this go? There we go. Okay. So this is just the outline that I wanted to talk about. I'm going to talk just a little bit about the trend that's happening nationwide and in Vermont. I'm going to talk about what's great about the adolescent brain, and I should say also the young adult brain, and why that matters to us. I'll talk about potential therapeutic benefits versus risks that we know about as far as cannabis in kids. I'll make a quick word to the parents in behalf of the kids. And when I say parents, I sort of mean like that's adoptive, biological, anybody that cares about kids. Do we have parents in here? Do we have grandparents in here? Do we have anybody who can't stand kids in here? Okay. So, but I will speak a little bit for the kids. So, and then lastly, kind of seeking solid ground. As David mentioned and Dr. Lansbury mentioned, this is really hard to learn about. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. So this is a national trend. A slide that I like to show is the pointer. There we go. There we go, red dot. Okay. This is great because this shows us 2 decades, and it's 8th, 10th, and 12th graders. So you see alcohol making a good downward trajectory. As an advocate for kids and thinking about them using these substances, that makes me really excited. Cigarettes makes me even more excited because the trajectory is even better. Illicit drugs, the trajectory has sort of hovered and mostly stayed stable. The next slide, I'm probably too far away. There we go. Next slide, this is Vermont-specific data. This comes from the Youth Risk Behavior study that happens every 2 years in the spring, and we just got pretty recently back the 2017 data. So as you can see, alcohol is decreasing significantly by about 10% over the past decade. Cigarettes also decreased by about 10% in prevalence over the past decade, and marijuana has stayed the same. So that's just to sort of get a sense of where I think we're doing some good education with kids and making a lot of progress, and where there's room for more education. This is just a brief graph of how kids are using marijuana, that it's really mostly still smoked. A few used through vaping or through other means, oral ingestion, but most are still smoking. So here's trends briefly in middle school and high school, and I wanted to talk about 2 sort of important indicators in the trends. One is you ask kids, do your parents think this is bad? And then you ask kids, do you think this is bad? Meaning, do you think there's a risk here? Do your parents think there's a risk here? Do your parents disapprove? And so if we just look sort of comparing from 2015 to 2017, the last couple of years, the trend that's happening is that middle school students are less likely to believe that their parents think it's a bad idea for them to use marijuana. And same thing for alcohol, just as sort of for a comparison. So a slight decrease in marijuana. And current middle school use is 4%, luckily quite low, but that's unchanged over the last couple of years. So these are the high school trends for the same questions, believing that your parents would think it's a bad idea for you to use marijuana. So down to 66% from 72%. So only 66% of high school students feel like their parents would think it was a bad idea for them to use marijuana, and then, alcohol, and then 76 for marijuana. Current high school use is about 24%. And this is really a really good sample. They got almost every single high school in the state and almost every single middle school in the state when they were asking these questions, with a really impressive response rate. So here's the next one is like, do you think it's dangerous, or do you think there's a great risk? And I didn't choose the language, but they did say a great risk. So, make of that what you will. But I thought this was interesting. So only 36% of high school students felt like it was a great risk to binge drink regularly. Only 68% thought it was a great risk to smoke a lot. and 24% felt like it was a great risk to use marijuana regularly. So I put that out there just to give us a little bit of a framework on what's going on here in this state. Part of the reason for that is this is hard to do scientifically, to get graphs that look like this. And you'll see this in probably every marijuana talk that you ever hear that has anything to do with kids or teenagers. But basically, if they don't think it's risky, they'll use more. If they think it's risky, they'll use less. And it mirrors, it's an amazing mirror scientifically. And then I wanted to just point out briefly, this is national data. This comes out of Monitoring the Future, which is a study that's done out of Michigan every single year looking at use and perception of harm. But this is for college. So over the last, and again, this is a couple years back, but you see a significant increase in the college-age population with use and a higher increase in non-college attendees compared to college attendees. So I think high school graduation isn't necessarily the finish line when we sort of think about how far we want to get people educated about using marijuana and the risk associated, and we'll talk about that a little bit as far as the brain goes. So this slide, this is where tomatoes will fly. Dr. Lansbury warned me a little bit. I have never seen number crunching and number sort of molding like I've seen with the data that are coming out of Colorado and Washington. I can go to a conference and walk in one lecture and hear like everything's fine, and turn around and the next hour walk into the other lecture and like the whole state is burning down. So it's hard to interpret these. So make of it what you will. In general, states that have legalized recreational marijuana use have the highest rates of adolescent use. They were already near the top. Adolescent use the trend is increasing in some of the states. And again, it's really hard to know. There's a lot of conflicting data back and forth. And I think about, it all depends sort of when you measure and how much you measure. And I found out that all the kids have started using because I measured it on April 20th. Well, and I found out no kids are using because I measured it on Tuesday morning compared to Friday night. So it depends what you're looking at. The rate of college age use, which has been increasing nationally as we saw, is increasing faster in those states than the national average. Adolescent use rates correlate with availability in general. One of the main pictures we have of that is dispensary density in Colorado. And then we know that marketing targets all audiences. So, that's kind of blurry. So, but this is a big deal. This is a big deal because you'll see it marketed towards kids, and we know it's big business. There's more marijuana dispensaries in Colorado than there are McDonald's and Starbucks combined. So it's big business there, and kids are going to see this type of stuff. So let me talk really quickly about neurobiology, which I think is super fascinating. So this is talking about synaptic pruning. So as our brains develop as little kids, they come sort of ready to rock, ready to learn all sorts of stuff. And the little neurons in kids' brains want to reach out and touch everything and be ready to learn everything and explore everything. And so a 7-year-old has this just massively connected but not super efficient neural network. So it's really connected. And then the process begins of deciding, okay, now we're like ready to connect anything that we're going to see or use or do. Am I going to learn the trumpet? And am I going to learn Russian? Am I going to become an artist, etc.? And the process begins in our adolescent years of pruning back and deciding, okay, now what are we going to make efficient and fast? So efficiency and connectivity. So there's a process called myelination. Some people are probably very familiar with that, but briefly, it's sort of an insulating factor that happens to nerve pathways that makes them really fast, much, much faster, 100 times faster at being able to send signals. So it's like going from a dirt road to light rail. Makes it super, super fast. And it also makes the nerves be able to send signals more frequently. So you get faster transmission and more frequent transmission that can equate to like 3,000 times capacity to send signals. 3,000 times increased capacity to send signals. This happens, this efficiency and this fastness happens in the limbic areas of the brain, which are like our drive, our gas. before it happens in the frontal lobe, which is more like our steering and our brakes. Jay Geed, who's an author, I love reading his stuff because he always emphasizes the adolescent brain is not a broken brain and it's not a half-baked adult brain. There's reasons why we want there to be sort of drive and maybe not as much steering and brakes. There's evolutionary reasons for that, and there's good reasons for that. We want separation, or else we'd all be 40-somethings living in the basement of our parents' house. We want exploration, or we'd have a whole bunch of inbreeding. So we want this to be happening. It's very normal, and it's very good for us in a lot of ways. But you'll see that there's approximately, this thing does not work very well. So there's approximately a 10-year mismatch between when the limbic region sort of gas comes online and gets really fast and efficient, and when the frontal cortex, prefrontal cortex comes online and gets fast and efficient. So that's a danger zone. That's sort of I should say it's a zone of concern. Again, there's good reasons for this. It's a zone of concern that we need to be aware of. So, and this data is really important for us to know about. This is across all substances, but it holds true for every substance when it's tested separately. So if your first use of drugs, I'm trying to get rid of this. Okay. If your first use of drugs was before you were 15, the likelihood of developing a substance use disorder is 6 to 7 times higher than if your first use of drugs wasn't until after you were 21. So different studies have shown different numbers, but your risk of developing a substance use disorder or a cannabis use disorder is much, much higher in those who have started to experiment with or use or be exposed to cannabis in their teenage years. And we saw that about 9% on average of adults, the numbers of those who are likely to develop a use disorder is a lot higher in kids. So let me talk briefly about the upside and the downside. Does anyone know how to get this pointer to stop dancing? Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. So the upside and the downside. Now, to be fair, we have spent a lot more time, energy, and money studying the downside than the upside. So that's important to know going through this, and hopefully those regulations will be changing. But there are definitely adverse effects of early use. We've seen impact of cannabis, negative impacts on this ability to efficiently prune those synapses, on the ability of the brain to efficiently myelinate those neural pathways to become fast and effective. Some of the hot issues are around cognition. So primary areas of deficit and this is all with early use of cannabis, is verbal learning, recall, attention most impacted. Dr. Lansbury talked about that in some detail. Some studies showing a measurable IQ decrease later in life. This is one that has been hotly contested. Some studies have shown that you can recover any cognitive deficits after a couple of years of abstinence. Some studies have shown that you don't recover that, but again, it's about how long you looked and how far you followed things forward. There is a strong association with an increased incidence of psychosis when kids use early. And there's a lot of research going into that as to why that would be. Again, an association, the research chooses its words pretty carefully. An association is different than a causation. That means there's a lot more learning for us to still do. So increased likelihood of anxiety disorders, increased likelihood of depression, again, when use starts early on. And then amotivation is one of the things that's been noted most in adolescence, and there's a lot of potential explanations for this, but Dr. Lansbury talked about the dopaminergic system, and when you get those sort of high charges of dopaminergic tone, it's hard from something that's not our natural system, it's hard for our natural systems to keep up with that. When you've used something that's like a floodgate of super high intense pleasure, it's hard for getting an A on a test to be quite that exciting anymore. So short-term effects of use, and Dr. Lansbury covered this pretty well, similar studies shown in kids compared to adults. Inattention, decreased reaction time, doubled risk of a car accident, short-term memory impairment, long-term use, decreased white matter integrity. White matter comes from those neurons getting layered with that insulating stuff, myelin. Poorer connectivity, poorer attention, processing speed, working memory. Again, do you recover that if you abstain? That's a research question that's being asked right now. And then impaired memory. That's some of these things you can see on an anatomical level, such as decreased hippocampus volume in adolescents who have used heavily over a prolonged period of time. So these are kind of hot topics. There's a little bit redundant, but cognition, motivation, and psychosis. I wanted to add a little bit more that you can have in the slides on those. So medical use of cannabinoids in children and adolescents. We have a long way to go on our learning and our research, and I want to make the what I'm thinking as the fruit salad analogy. Dr. Lansbury mentioned that within cannabis, within the whole plant, there's all sorts of active chemicals. There's all sorts of active chemicals that we know nothing about. There's all sorts of cannabinoids that work on those receptors. And so what we're trying to figure out is if cantaloupe helps you not have kidney stones, then let's study cantaloupe for kidney stones, not fruit salad for kidney stones. Because maybe watermelon causes blindness and grapes cause hangnails. You know, so who knows? But that's kind of where we're at. And so when you're reading this stuff, when you're looking through the literature, it's really important to ask yourself, what are we talking about? Are we talking about the whole plant? Are we talking about something that's already been pulled out, purified THC, purified CBD? And that'll help a lot as we're reading through the literature to know what we're talking about. Because as you'll see here, marijuana, the whole thing, isn't FDA approved for anything in kids. No FDA approval. But there is some evidence that certain parts of the plant, certain cannabinoids could be beneficial for kids for certain things. So right now, there's a certain type of seizure disorder, two of them, Lennox-Gastaut seizures and Dravet syndrome. This is a small minority of seizure disorders in kids, but as Dr. Lansbury mentioned, Epidiolex, it's a purified form of CBD, was approved just pretty recently for pediatric use. Some other areas where we have a stronger signal of potential benefit is for chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. And weaker signals are in there, and pain is in there too, I apologize. So there's some mixed signals about treatment of pain in kids, weaker signals and anecdotal stuff, Tourette syndrome, spasticity, neuropathic pain, PTSD. So we'll have pediatricians sometimes ask us, what do I tell parents who come to me asking about if this is going to be an option? They're desperate. They've tried so many different things. Their child is still struggling with a different condition or that or the other. Right now, the benefits that we've seen have been in pretty small studies, and so we have a long way to go. We have a long way to go. There was a really good review just done in the journal Pediatrics. So good review in a good journal that talks a lot about it. They pulled, I think, 22 articles, and 17 out of the 22 articles didn't have a control group, which is a pretty important part of medical research. I'm not saying that to, it's just where we're at. It's just where we're at. But to be able to give one group something and the other group not give it, and then watch two groups and compare them, that's pretty important. So we're really in our infancy as far as the research goes. And there's a reason for that. It's not because we've been lazy. There's political reason for that, and we'll talk more about that briefly. I just want to check where we're at. Okay, because I want to make time for the question and answer, because your contributions will be very valuable. So just briefly, the process of prescribing a medication when we're talking about medical use. When we do that as physicians, we tell how much to take, how often to take it, when to take it, what route to take it. We give a lot of direction, and we give that for a reason, because that's sort of what's been studied. And so those are areas where we just don't know enough yet. So I put up here just briefly sort of where I try to find a little bit of my ground, because and there may be varying opinions on this here. Some people will say this is just sort of what's what's keeping all the ingenuity down. But I've participated a little bit in the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry on trying to come up with position statements. It's like tons and tons and tons and tons of reading and research and thinking and revising goes into making a paragraph this long about what does our association think about cannabis and kids. So you'll see a pattern through all of these that most of the medical societies in the country, including the American Academy of Pediatrics, oppose medical marijuana outside of an FDA process. They oppose legalization for recreational use, support research, and this is a big thing, is moving it from Schedule 1, which has prevented a lot of research, to moving it to a different schedule so that it's more accessible to research. Advocate for strict enforcement of rules against marketing, rules against the sale to children with a 21 age minimum. And if you are asking me, sort of from what we see about myelination, the farther we could push that forward, 22, 23, 24, you're going to be in a lot safer territory as far as risk of addiction. Opposing smoking in any form, and then discouraging use of cannabis in the presence of children. And then the American Medical Association, I included the position statements here. These are the most updated position statements, one about research in cannabinoids and one about legalization for medical use. And so again, both of these support, let's find a way to study this more effectively. Let's pull back the restrictions that have made it really hard to study. So we're left wondering, we know about all these risks, and again, we've learned more about the risks than the benefits because that's where time and energy and money has been spent. And now we're going forward to learn what are the characteristics of exposure or use that convey the highest risk. So if we're going to try to explore this as a medical option, and if we're trying to think about this as and just preventing the risks of a recreational option, what are the aspects that convey the highest risk? And I highlighted age of onset of use because that's something that we are seeing again and again and again and again. The earlier you use any substance, because your brain is still growing, it's still learning, it's ready to learn the trumpet, it's ready to learn Russian, it's ready to learn soccer, and unfortunately it's ready to learn substance use disorders and addictive patterns. It's more ripe for all of that. Teaching, nurturing, protecting. Briefly, just a thought coming from myself as a child and adolescent psychiatrist. We tend to think that young people don't care what their family thinks. It's sort of colloquial, like they're not going to listen to you whatsoever. They're only going to care what their peers think. Research tells us that that's not accurate, that adolescents really do care what their families think, and parents' impressions, parents' roles are really important in their perspective of what's safe and what's not safe. This is from Diana Baumrind, who talks in sort of a simplistic way about thinking about how we parent. We can have high expectations or low expectations, and we can be warm and fuzzy, or we can be cold. And so the place that is the most protective, and it's overly simplified, and whoever has kids knows there's not just 4 ways to parent. But the most protective way for kids is the authoritative parent, where they have high expectations, but they're also available and nurturing. I put this up there because it's a study that I really liked. It came from Ohio. It was done by a combined team from Harvard and UCSD, and they looked at this parenting style. They mapped out the social network, like who's who in high school, and whose parents in that social network have authoritative parenting style. So I put this up there, just like shout out for parents who want to work well, who want to be good listeners, who want to talk with kids, because what they found in this study is almost like a drop of food coloring going into a bowl of water. If you had, and this was for mothers in particular, if you had one authoritative mother, you could watch that influence spread, not just to her own kid, but her kids' social circles, in decreasing the risk. And this graph specifically was for marijuana use, and I'll spare the time of talking about what the circles, squares, et cetera mean. I just wanted to remind me to reference this study. So I included a couple references just talking about positive parenting. There's some really good stuff out there, not needing to reinvent the wheel. How do I talk about this with my kids? Well, there's a lot of people in here that have kids or have grandkids. So talking early, talking often, talking when things are calm, not talking about it when it's a spat or when it's angry or when people are hyped up. Telling them what you're worried about and actually speaking up. ParentUpVermont.org, that's a good resource that's state specific. They have a free marijuana talk kit for parents that are really terrified. I don't know how to do this. I don't know what to say. So that's useful. Here are some warning signs thinking about the use for kids. Acute mood changes, acute changes in school performance, changes in friends or sort of becoming isolative and not wanting parents to know who their friends are, changes in concentration and memory lapses. I add this in to show that the heritability of substance use disorders is very high. So if substances have become problematic for members of the family in the past, then it's really important, it's extra important to talk with kids about the potential risks that are going on. Marijuana falls right within there. So thinking about half of your risk is heritable of developing a substance use disorder, about half of your risk is environmental. So actions speak louder than words. Words speak louder than no words. Surprisingly, a lot of kids in research studies have said that they're not sure. Their parents have never mentioned anything about it. So again, here speaking for the kids, sort of advocating that this is an area where there's a really, really higher risk of developing problematic use in cannabis when it's done in the high school years, and showing those trends of kids themselves thinking it's less risky, thinking that their parents are less concerned about it, and the use kind of holding steady as opposed to decreasing really nicely with alcohol and cigarettes. So, seeking solid ground. Hopefully this can prompt some of the discussion that comes up and thinking about how have we gotten here. Grassroots activism. Part of that is because there are people who have found this to be a really beneficial option and have found the medical and scientific community behind, slow, not able to produce the research to back that up. Again, partly because of restrictions. Pharmacological ingenuity. I think Dr. Lansbury falls within this category. People that are a wealth of knowledge and learning so much about this system and trying to look for signals of benefit and going forward. Private profiteering. There, as we talked about, huge market, huge money in this area. And so what's happening right now is you see policy moving ahead of science, which is very clear that policy as far as medicinal use, policy as far as recreational use is moving ahead of science. As that happens, we move in a direction outside of this Venn diagram. We move lacking one piece of really making good decisions. So this was something that was hammered into my head in medical school, that evidence-based medicine is research plus your clinical experience plus what the patient wants, right? And so that's a really good place to try and find sort of safe ground. And moving towards policy while we're sort of waiting for the science to come along is where we're at right now. And so we need to catch up on it. And that's where I'll stop.
We'll start our 30-minute Q&A session now. If you raise your hand, I can come and bring a microphone to you, and I just ask again that if you don't have a microphone in your hand, you don't ask a question. Yes.
Marijuana is not a new drug. Wasn't there a lot of research done in the 60s and 70s? What was discovered then? Does it have any relevance to now?
So the research that was done in the 60s and 70s was mostly done with respect to addiction. The medical marijuana studies are mostly done using THC because it was federally Schedule I, it was illegal to really study it as a medication. And so once they made a synthetic THC, that became FDA approved back in the 1980s for chemotherapy-induced nausea and pain. because patients were self-prescribing cannabis, and it was Schedule 1, so there wasn't any way to really study its medical value. So most of the data that we actually have for clinical trials was with THC, and now we have some with CBD. There were a few studies done with smoked and vaped cannabis, whole plant cannabis, and they do parallel it with respect to the nausea and respect to pain. But we really just don't have enough evidence for whole plant cannabis to make a clear indication. But there are so many patients that are self-medicating with medical cannabis and have self-reported good effects. And some of the studies with, for example, addiction disorder, where patients are self-reporting that they're using less opioid when they're using cannabis. But the problem is that there's not a lot of funding available for those types of studies because of the federal restriction. So it keeps coming back to that scheduling. If they make it Schedule 2, it's like an opioid where it's still going to be restricted, but we can do clinical trials. So there wasn't that much done for medical cannabis, whole plant, back in the 60s.
And I guess I would add to that when we're looking back, right now we have so much more available to us on both the benefit side and the risk side. We have an ability to sort of isolate compounds more than we have done in the past. We have things available that can be studied. At the same time, on the studies of risks, we have a lot different product than we once had. The THC content in marijuana is on average increasing. The forms that you can use are changing all the time. You have butter and wax and shatter and all sorts of stuff that can have really different concentrations. And so even though we have some information, it's really it's something that we need to keep up with for both the benefits and the risks, because things are changing a lot.
Okay. People have worked so hard for years to reduce the incidence of smoking and hopefully reduce lung cancer, and now smoking of marijuana is coming back. The popular image is that smoking marijuana has no effect on the lungs, but in the literature it does have some effect, and I'm just asking you, how much of an effect does smoking marijuana have? And I have a second question regarding edibles. I think there's almost no literature on the nutritional effect on absorption and digestion of substances in edibles, and I'm kind of concerned that people may eat one meal along with cannabis one day and get an effect, and another day eat a different meal, and one of the examples is the fat level can greatly affect the absorption of some of these substances. Has that been addressed at all? And particularly it's worrisome when you talk about edibles being available for little children, where one meal one day may affect the response in them, and another meal the next day may have a quite different effect on them. So there are two questions.
Yeah. I can take the lung aspect. So the with lung, the difference between cigarette smoking and cannabis smoking is that the amount that is smoked is so much less for cannabis. So there hasn't, while there are, when it's burnt versus vaped, there's combustion, there are definitely carcinogens in the smoke from cannabis cigarette. The reason why there hasn't really been an association is because even heavy users of cannabis aren't smoking nearly as many cigarettes as you would with tobacco. So there hasn't been the association. That doesn't mean that you're not inhaling those toxins, but there hasn't been an association. There has been a strong association with bronchitis for heavy users, in that that's one thing that you can look for even in a teenager. If they have a cough that doesn't go away, it's a sign that should get looked at and maybe investigate whether they could potentially be chronically using cannabis. So the other question is related to absorption. You want me to take that one too?
Yes,
so
I was hoping to punt the second
the
one
absorption, you're absolutely right. The cannabinoids that are in the edibles are very lipophilic. They love lipid. So if you have a lot of fat in your diet, they're going to get co-absorbed across the GI tract much. They do get absorbed really easily, which is why they also work in a patch form. Like if you put a patch, because the cannabinoids are so lipidy, they can cross right through your membranes. And they're also good sublingual. The sprays, if you've ever heard of Sativex, it's a spray, or cannabidiol that you put under your tongue, gets absorbed really easily. So the main concern with taking an edible with food is more that it may disrupt some of the absorption of vitamins, but again, you're not using that much. So if somebody uses an edible, it's generally like a quarter of a cookie is the dose. The issue more with kids is that these edibles are very yummy, and there have been many instances of ER visits with children who have eaten an entire marijuana cookie. And while it's not like an opioid where they're gonna stop breathing, an overdose with cannabis can cause high anxiety in patients, especially, and kids, they can get like a hyperanxiety. So it's not something that's probably going to kill them, but it is something. There's not been any deaths from overdose of edibles, but there have been many ER visits from sickness. Who's got the microphone?
Okay, I'm Ann Taylor from Burlington, and I could probably spend at least 2 hours here discussing, okay? But I'm going to try to keep my list of questions to about 3 or 4. If there's anybody else who really needs to talk, just raise your hand so I won't go too far into it, all right? Okay, you? All right. Okay, I would like to invite Dr. Peterson. Jackson. Well, I wrote it down incorrectly.
That's all right.
Okay. I'd like to invite you to no longer use the word marijuana because it's coming from the nasty movie, 1930s, Reefer Madness, that threw cannabis into the evil garbage can for 90 years. And they picked it because it's Mexican, and they associated cannabis with the low-end Mexicans.
Ms. Taylor, I am sorry. Can you keep it to questions only? We just want to be respectful of our other guests here who also have questions.
Yes, but this is very yes. Okay. But it's important that we no longer use the word marijuana. It's cannabis, legally and scientifically.
I do respectfully ask that we keep it to questions only.
Who is the doctor who discovered the endocannabinoid receptor system in 1990?
Dr. McCollum. Dr. McCollum, it's in Israel.
Okay,
and
I'll ask
in
you
Israel.
later.
He discovered both the endocannabinoids and the cannabinoid receptors.
Great.
And they've since then discovered the CB2 receptor, which is in the immune cells, that is thought to be perhaps the reason why there's anti-inflammatory effects of the cannabinoids.
Awesome. I work with pain management, and the CBD thing has been extraordinarily wonderful.
Yeah, as a note,
now,
the research that's been done in other countries is actually quite a bit ahead of us. There's pharmaceutical company, GW Pharmaceutical, which actually they're the ones who got Epidiolex, the CBD, FDA approved despite the fact that CBD is a Schedule I drug. I don't know how they did it, but they somehow did it. And they have another drug called Sativex, which is in clinical trials, that is a combination of THC and CBD. Because I don't know if you remember when I talked about THC has a lot of side effects when you use it just by itself. Anxiety, some people get nausea. They don't like to use it. And that's one of the reasons why patients look to whole plant cannabis, because they don't like to take just THC. They don't feel good. It makes them, the psychoactive effects are not pleasurable. And so this combination has fewer of those side effects because the CBD seems to really temper some of the THC effects. And although it's in clinical trials here, stage 3, it's already accepted all over Europe, all over the Middle East. They've already accepted this medication for multiple sclerosis, for Parkinson's, for pain, for a number of disorders. So we do, I think his fruit salad analogy is good, because if we had these types of medications that were good combinations that actually work, and you can regulate how much dose is in them so you're not getting different strains with different levels of THC, then we could have some real medicines there.
Do you consider cannabis to be an herb or a medicine?
Oh, it's both.
Okay.
I mean, we have so many herbal medications.
Yes.
I mean, where did we get aspirin? We got it from willow bark. You know, where did we get opioids? We got morphine from the poppy. You know, I just showed in that we get a lot of medications from herbs.
And the receptor.
We have other guests here who would like to ask questions, but you can come down and speak with them at the end. Yep, thank you.
Hi, I'd like to just make a point that in neuromotor disease, I know that the neuro unit at McGill was very aggressive about saying that cannabis, I was going to say marijuana, but I guess that cannabis is really was really all they had to offer, and very useful. And I know in you know, anecdotally that was the case. I just want to make that point. And I didn't notice that neuromotor disease was listed.
Yeah, that would be like multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's.
And ALS. And
ALS, there's been fewer studies in ALS, but there are a lot of case reports of uses for a lot of neurological disorders. And you know, one thing that's also interesting is that the cannabinoid receptors are much higher density in your brain than any opioid receptors. You have a ton of these receptors for these molecules, and we just really don't know exactly how we can use that system for medical benefit without having the risks of addiction for cannabis.
Hi, thanks. After decades of research, the National Institute of Health was able to find a low-risk use of alcohol, roughly like no more than 3 drinks in a day, no more than 7 in a week. We're a long way off on the research side, but do you think we, other than none, we will get to a definition of low-risk use around cannabis? And could you begin to approximate where we might go with that?
Do you want to take that one?
Sure, yeah. I think that's definitely possible. I see that in clinical populations a lot. I think there are people that, you know, I think research, we don't have it as you mentioned, but I see that in a lot of the patients that I work with in the addiction treatment program that have had substance use disorders for other classes of substances and are able to keep their cannabis use at a completely moderate level. So yeah, I think definitely we can get there. I liked the slide that Dr. Lansbury showed of sort of dependency risk versus physical risk, and yeah, cannabis is not as high as most substances that we treat in our clinic. So to that point, when we work in the, you'll see in the area of addiction treatment, you'll see sort of a wide range from abstinence-based programs to harm reduction programs. And I think that in general, we try to balance within our program looking at those risks. So cannabis use is not something that is an absolute sort of deal breaker for someone receiving treatment for an opioid use disorder. And I think it's good that it's that way, because we want to monitor, you know, we want to monitor what's causing the greatest harm. And that goes a lot to just listening to patients that we work with and trying to get a good understanding of what's getting in your way and what's not getting in your way, and trying to understand what they want to be doing and what they want to have, what makes their life fulfilling. And in several patients I've seen, it's not getting in their way. Yeah.
To add to that, it's like, if we could all do everything in moderation, we'd all be fine, right? But anything worth doing seems to be worth overdoing in the human population, which is really where you run into addiction problems.
Hi, thank you. Great talk, so thank you very much. I'd like to go back to the topic of recreational overdoses, and the question I have is, if we do see legalization of marijuana and increased recreational use, how does that strain your ability as providers to service other patients that may perhaps have more pressing needs?
Do you want to start?
Sure, I can. I mean, I'm a PhD, not a physician, but what we see with emergency room visits is there are more emergency room visits from, there's a disorder from chronic use of cannabis, which is a vomiting disorder. So you think of it being anti-nausea, but in chronic users, they can develop this cyclical vomiting pattern that's an emergency room. And overdose, but overdose is relatively rare for patients who smoke cannabis. Overdose is mostly seen with edibles because it takes a lot longer for the effect. And so somebody may, oh, well, this isn't working, I'm gonna take some more. And then the next thing they know, they feel like time has stopped. So it's the anxiety association with losing track of what your normal perceptions are. And so patients feel very highly anxious and head to the ER. So obviously patients that are coming in for that would take away from other types of care. So in that aspect, yes, but you have more experience with actual care.
Yeah, so I guess is your question primarily sort of what percent of our time is spent focused on cannabis use and use disorders compared to the availability of time that we have to spend on other areas?
Yeah, I guess my question is more along the lines of if you have increased recreational use, I assume you're going to get a higher incidence of recreational overdose. And so assuming those patients do present to the ER, that obviously takes ER staff, but also just if you do get perhaps substance use disorders, more of those in general because of increased recreational use, how much does that, take up? What do you think happens to your time as a provider, given that there's a lot more users that are going to be provided?
Yeah. Going back to that slide about sort of cause of harm and likelihood of dependence, in the emergency room, you're going to see far, 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 far more emergency cases of alcohol use, sedative hypnotic use, opioid use, cocaine use, far, far more of that than you would see with marijuana in general. But I think sort of that overlapping and the piggybacking makes it particularly difficult to navigate assessing somebody's other co-occurring psychiatric challenges if they exist. So anxiety and depression, those are two areas where the research is really muddy. And so that makes it difficult. As more and more people are using cannabis, I think it becomes, that's one challenge that I've seen clinically, is I'm trying to hear people saying this makes my anxiety better, and well, research shows us it makes anxiety worse in kids and maybe better in adults. And so trying to sort through that, it adds one more variable. So I think that's a clinical challenge for sure, where it can overlap.
Hi, I have a question, Catherine Antley from Burlington. And just as a parent, if I were here, attending, I feel like I would want to know that the industry of addiction, the marijuana industry, of which I'm sure there are people here who are interested in going into that industry, it will not make any profit unless they produce addicts. And that's a quote that we have from our RAND report. So we know that 80% of the product is consumed by 20% of the population. And that the easiest way for the industry to create an addict, which is their profit center, is to, as you showed, target those kids with the candies and any other way that they possibly can, exercising their full First Amendment rights, which we haven't been successful at curtailing in Colorado and California. And so I'm really feeling like parents should really be, I really feel like parents in this situation, do you feel like parents in this situation should be warned that their children, as they're born, their brains are going to be the target of this marijuana industry, that they're really going to be throwing everything at them in terms of the advertising, but also in terms of the very high concentration of THC, which makes it much more addictive. So, I mean, as a parent, I think that's something I would want to know about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes, and yes. Parents should definitely be warned. That's why we're here. But it's also, I mean, marketing of cigarettes did the same thing. Marketing of alcohol, I think kids kids just, they need us. They need us to kind of watch out for them because they don't get to help make the rules. And so I appreciate your concern. I think it's a very valid concern. And we try to spend time talking to both parents and kids in this area because it is the risk and the potential harms are so much higher in early use.
And to balance that a little bit, the reason why there's so much social pressure to legalize and medical marijuana is because patients have been seeing some relief from some disorders from the medical cannabis. And as we talked about tonight, the different chemicals that have those medicinal uses, there is potential for research where you could find a way in which you could make a less addicting medication that would still provide the benefit that medical cannabis does to some patients, that would satisfy the social pressure to legalize, and yet at the same time, much caution with the public health aspect of cannabis itself used recreationally, which we know has risks, especially in the pediatric population.
Quick comment about that. One of the things we learned about kids and tobacco was that telling kids that in 50 years they're going to have health problems didn't really change their behavior very much. But telling them that they're actually being duped by an industry and they're a pawn and their hard-earned money is going into the pockets of people who don't care about their welfare, that actually worked. And so we may see the same thing with cannabis.
In relation to overdosing and concentration of THC and the lower risk dose or marketing even, how do you manage dosage of cannabis? How do you, with different strains and different ways of ingesting it, how do you mitigate that, manage that, regulate that, understand that as a consumer, as a user?
That's a really good question because what we found actually right here in the Montpelier dispensary, they did a large study of the different strains of the cannabis and measuring different compounds in them. And what they found is that not only are there varying amounts of THC and CBD in these strains, but even in what's called the same strain that's grown in a different environment can have different levels of these compounds. And that's another reason why it's really difficult to prescribe medical cannabis, which we can't anyway, as physicians can't officially prescribe it. They can just sign off on a form that the patient can get a card, and then they are on their own really to go to the dispensary. I think dispensaries are trying to get more help with respect to the pharmacy aspects, but it's not like you can say, okay, I need this exact strain that has this exact amount, and I'm going to take this amount of dose, and that's going to be effective, because there's been the study that this amount actually works, and this amount gives side effects, and this amount just isn't enough, so it doesn't work. And that's where we're really, really behind on the science with this. So patients have to do trial and error with medical cannabis, and it's really too bad.
We're going to take 2 more questions. We have one back here.
Okay, I have the microphone over here. I'm a retired RN, and I have 3 doctors, and I'm looking for a doctor who will work with me as I try to treat my chronic pain. How do you find somebody like that? I go to my primary care, and I say, well, you need guidance, and that's the end of the conversation. It's like the sleep disorders doctor says, well, see a psychiatrist. And, it's like, it's important that you have the right drug, the right dose, the right time, the right frequency, and the right route. And you can do that with regular prescription drugs, but you can't do it with marijuana. It's a guessing game.
It's very true.
I think that, I'd like to treat my chronic pain, but, it's
and you should be cautious because you don't want to just, and if you're taking other medications, there is a possibility of some interactions. They're not, compared to a lot of other medications, the the cannabinoids don't have a huge amount of interaction, but they do get metabolized by the body. So you want to make sure that you're not taking a dose or a type.
Like with your sleeping pill, you don't mix that with.
And I will stress again, it's at the federal level, the scheduling, if they just simply move it down to Schedule 2, the science can catch up with that.
Okay, so how do we get it to Schedule 2?
Well, there's a lot of public pressure, and public pressure has worked at the state level, so I mean.
Okay, and we have our final question up here.
I was wondering, has there been any research looking at a correlation between cannabis use and the amount of screen time people are on their devices or computers?
Do you know what
I mean? I don't know of any. But I do think we know some about the addictive nature that can happen for some people with screen time, that similar pathways are involved. But I don't know of any specific studies in kids that show a higher association or a higher risk of cannabis use for a kid that uses X amount of time on the screens. I don't know. Do you know of any?
I know there's a lot of clinical trial. If you go to clinicaltrials.gov and you put in the search term cannabis, 435 trials will come up. And about 2/3 of them are related to addiction or some kind of relationship with addiction. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was one that was associating cannabis use with addiction. The ones that are medically related are mostly individual cannabinoids that they're testing for different disorders. Again, very few. There are a few vaping studies with whole plant cannabis because the vaping reduces the amount of carcinogens, but still not very many studies. Right.
We could do it.
Yeah. He's suggesting that we could do that type of study right here. So the studies that are related to addiction, you can easily do those types of studies. It's the medical studies that are difficult to do.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out to Community Medical School. We hope you'll join us on November 6th for Dr. Gilbert's presentation on diabetes.